Right. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for coming to Garlands today for a Gardening 101 class. I'm Mitch Piles. I'll be leading you through a little ins and outs of how to get going if you're not too familiar with gardening. And even if you are, I'll hopefully have some nice tidbits for you that you may or may not have known. I'm really going to be touching mostly on basics. So I'll go over a lot of the real rudimentary type of stuff, and then we'll get into some things where you may want to ask some more questions and have a little more detailed discussion sort of at the end. And we'll open that up to some questions. Turn that off. So yeah, I'm going to begin with just kind of showing you the ideas between the different types of plants that we have available for landscapes and gardens. And I'll start with, we just have our basic breakdown of things that are broadleaf evergreens or evergreens and deciduous plants. And deciduous plants are those that lose their leaves every year. A lot of people do know that, but there are many different forms that can take, between shrubs, grasses, all the way up to really large trees. And then the same thing goes for evergreens. We've got grasses, shrubs, all the way up to really large trees as well. And so that just gives us a general breakdown of how the two sides of things work out with regards to leaf formation and how they go through the seasons. And the next thing that we want to learn a little bit about as we get into, discussing what do I do in my garden every year, are the differences between annuals and perennial plants. Annuals are plants that we have available every year. They're usually grown from seed, and they're going to be harvested or grow out their entire life cycle within one growing season. Whereas perennials will have potentially a really long growing season, much longer than your typical annual, but will go into a dormancy period during the winter typically for most of our perennials that we carry. And then during that dormancy is sort of an energy storage time that those plants are going through, so that in the spring they can then regrow with new growth, and that storage is what they're growing from out of the winter dormancy. And so those are your two different kinds of annual and perennial. Perennial being that it's going to come back every year, whether you want it to or not. Typically, sometimes that's the curse of some plants, and other times it's the blessing. One of the things that I'm a big proponent of is perennial foods, and that's something that I'll discuss a little bit of today as well, because that's where, with minimal effort, your initial effort is the biggest part of it. You can get a perennial food crop that every year, that same month, you're going to be able to grow and harvest those foods. Something that, as we get into uncertain future and the costs of things are just going skyrocketing, turns out instead of paying $6 for a pint of strawberries, paying $6 for several plants of strawberries that will then grow much more than that is becoming a lot more valuable to the average homeowner that maybe wasn't necessary for quite some time. And then the next bit we'll discuss as well is kind of the differences between ornamental plants and edibles, being that edibles you're after a harvest that you can consume. And ornamentals offer us a beauty or an aesthetic appeal to some, or they can function as a blockade as well for things like deer or daughters' boyfriends outside their windows. That's a great example I give for things with thorns. If you have a daughter, you plant things with thorns below their windows, you won't have anyone sneaking in. That's my joke for the day. I'm not very good at them, so I'll go from there. So yeah, those are some basic breakdowns, and so I'll give you some examples here to begin with. One that I really like to point out is deciduous trees and shrubs in general, despite losing their leaves, can offer a lot of year-round beauty. Despite, the leaves are gone, the flowers are gone, there's wonderful color that can be accommodated. So this right here is a Japanese maple called a coral bark maple. And it's one where it has a really wonderful look to it throughout the year, but as it goes into the fall, it gets a really vibrant color change in its foliage, and then the vibrancy of the color on your stems is also increased throughout the winter. The colder it gets, the brighter this tree gets, which is a really cool offering because so much of us in the Willamette Valley are looking for that breakup of how do we get through the like greens and grays of the winter, and having options like this that, despite being in its dormant period, offer great beauty for a landscape and garden. So this is a deciduous tree, and then we have our deciduous shrubs here. This is a deciduous and a flowering shrub, so this is considered more on your ornamental side of things. And this is another one that I like to showcase this time of year because it offers winter breakup. This is one of the first things to bloom every year. It's called a Forsythia. It's something you'll see lining all the highways. They sometimes, once you plant a few, they pop up accidentally in lots of places, especially along those highway hedgerows that the ODOT and landowners have planted, providing just another breakup of your winter monotony typically. So these are great plants I like to showcase because they look great all summer long, but their biggest focal point is actually during the winter. Which is something that, you know, if you're getting going early on, it's nice to find those pockets of interest throughout the year. And then another end of things is we have our broadleaf evergreen trees. So this is an option I like to showcase. It's one of my favorite magnolias. This is the Edith Bogue magnolia. It grows to about 20 to 25 feet tall, gets about 15 foot wide. It's sort of a really globous type, and it has these amazingly beautiful white flowers that open up to about an 8-inch circle. And so they provide year-round beauty by being evergreen. It's this nice big foliage, and then once a year they'll flush out with really large blossoms, something that's really fun to showcase in a landscape.
But don't they drop those ugly things?
Everything of beauty has its sort of consequences, and
so that's not an ugly free dropper then. They didn't like.
Well, that's a matter of opinion. I'm not going to say any of the things I'm showcasing today are ugly. However, deciduous things in general, these will all lose and become messy. Leaves fall, so on. This, despite being evergreen, will have leaves that lose all year long, but it'll be a moderate amount throughout the year. But then once the flower has subsided, you will be left with what looks like a pine cone of sorts, and those tend to drop. But you know, a blossom of, there might be 200 or 300 on a really large tree, and they don't all fall at once. It's periodical. Like this one looks like it's dropped all of its from last year.
And you don't want to park it over your driveway because you'll get dents in your car when they're big.
Okay.
I know somebody it happened to.
Again, certain placement of certain plants, it's always worth noting, but that's one I've never heard with magnolias, so it's a new one for me. These ones can handle quite a bit of water. They do demand a little bit more than, you know, it's not considered a drought tolerant plant. It's just one that I like to showcase because the broadleaf evergreen in tree form is pretty rare. We have it classically across lots of shrubs, things, hedgerows, things like that. But having something that we can have year-round green foliage that's large, it's not your typical evergreen, which is your classic Doug firs and conifers, things of that nature that are going to, you know, be the basis for what Oregon winters sort of have to them. This offers that breakup. It's a wonderful white flower for you, although perhaps not parking underneath them is the best idea. Yeah, so that's a broadleaf evergreen in a tree form. We also have a broadleaf evergreen here in a shrub form. This is Spring Bouquet Viburnum. It's one that offers us, again, an early spring flowering with also having an evergreen throughout the winter. Something that won't die back, it won't lose its foliage. It's worth noting that this is a shrub that can get upwards of 10 to 12 feet tall. So the shrub spectrum goes from really tiny to rather large, almost like a small tree. And then we have trees going from rather small, such as this maple, to this full size is going to be, you know, upwards of 25 feet and 15 feet wide when it's fully grown. And then we have conifers like this one here, which can get upwards of, you know, over 100 feet, 30 or 40 feet wide as well.
Is there any kind of magnolia grow indoor?
Not that I'm aware of. I have heard of some people bonsaiing Magnolia, but it does require going through a dormancy period. Despite being evergreen, it will also still go through a dormancy period. And then, so now I'm going to touch base on some of the soil types we'll get into when you talk about your gardening, and what you may encounter at your property. And the three bases are, we have clay, which is your smallest particles of soil, and it's rather sticky. You'll have definitions of these in your handouts as well. If you want to get into more detail, it's a little bit more detail on that definition. It's also one of the most common soils throughout the Willamette Valley, so we all have to deal with it in some way or another. The levels at which, depending on where you are, may change. The next aspect of soil that we deal with is silt, which is particles that we range between the sizes of clay and sand being the third component and the largest particle of soil that we have. So the combination of those three things are what make up a loam soil. Loam soil are equal parts clay, equal parts silt, and equal parts sand. Now there are sayings within loam soils like silty loam or a clay loam or a sandy loam, and that just means that first indicator is the higher ratio of those three that'll be in that soil. So those of us who deal with the clay the most, which is probably a lot of us, we always encourage when we send people home with plants to add organic matter, and we have what's called a soil building conditioner available, and we try and sell it with everything because it helps guarantee that you're breaking up some of that clay and providing a better home for the plants that you're purchasing. And so I'll get into some aspects of timing of planting as well. Spring is one of our best times. March and April are our wetter months that offer us some free watering, if you will. Mother Nature is helping us out. And then as we get later into the spring, we do dry out enough that we want to more focus on watering what we have rather than transplanting new things. Summer is not an ideal time to be planting things. We want to focus that energy into the spring and in the fall. And things to plant in the spring be like your vegetable crops, things that you want to grow every year. And I brought a couple of my favorites up here to show everyone. This is a purple Brussels sprouts, and then we have a white storage onion called Gladstone. These are two that I really like a lot because Brussels sprouts are packed full of protein. They're kind of a superfood. And they're one of my favorite vegetables growing up, which is an anomaly for a lot because most kids seem to hate them. I love them. And I love growing them now. They're a fascinating plant. The little Brussels grow on the stem itself. And just something that you can incorporate into the garden early in the spring because they're very cold tolerant as well. Something that I like to deal with are cold tolerant things so I can get an early jump on my food growing for the season. And then the white onions I like a lot because they store well and you can grow a lot of them in a small amount of space. And being able to grow a lot amount in a small amount of space and then store them for a lengthy period of time can be beneficial just from the enjoyment of doing so, as well as getting the longest amount of value out of the harvest that you got. And then a couple other edible things that I like to plant through the spring as well are our caneberries and bushberries. So I have an example here. This is my favorite plant. It's a plant pic I put on our website. This is an evergreen huckleberry. It's native to Oregon. It's one of my favorites partly because I had two of them along a pathway growing up, and it was an amazing snack walking to the backyard. And so that's something I like to incorporate and inform people about, that your landscape doesn't have to just be ornamental or pretty. It can be edible as well. And so this offers that opportunity. It's the native. It grows into a shrub form. It's an evergreen, so you'll be able to have that color and look all year. And the foliage can be used in arrangements during the holiday season as well.
Does it require full sun?
No, in fact, it actually is a shade-loving plant. So they tend to do quite better in shade. It can tolerate some sun, but full sun, it will die. And so this just being one of my favorites, I wanted to showcase it. And then a couple others here that I like are these two caneberries. We have a marionberry here, which is our state berry. created at Oregon State and developed out of Marion County Extension Services, which is a really cool claim to fame for Oregon State. And then it's a seedless blackberry as well. So if you're always getting blackberry seeds stuck in your teeth, this is a great alternative. And then on the other side of things, people tend to hate caneberries because they are spiny and have spikes. And so I brought in here the Thornless Boysenberry we have available, which is a wonderful option for those who want to have more workability with what you're growing, not having to have gloves on all the time. And the berry is an amazing flavor to it. It's a little bit of tart, a lot of bit of sweet, and they're really juicy. So these are 3 plants I really like to showcase for the avid berry eater. They're a wonderful fresh eater. They all store well. They also preserve well.
So the seedless blackberry, how much sun, how much shade?
These can go full sun. They'll tolerate shade, but all of the berries, cane berries we sell are full sun. And then the last one I have here showcased is for those of you who may not have a lot of space. We have what's called raspberry shortcake. This is a raspberry variety that was bred specifically to be grown in containers for patio gardens. So if you don't feel you have either the commitment or the space to be able to go right into your yard with it, this provides you an opportunity to still have a raspberry harvest while just having a pot on your porch.
How big a pot would that require?
Typically 10 gallons is what we try and say. So that, I mean, give or take, they're roughly 14 inches across and about 12 to 14 inches deep as well. It does seem like a large pot, but that is so you won't have to transplant it again. Okay. That will give it enough space to grow for many years without feeling like it's choked out or anything. And again, it is designed to grow in a container. It's made to do that. But if you give it a slightly bigger container, it'll do slightly better.
Would it need to be taken in the winter?
Nope. They go through their dormancy in the soil. You can plant these in a row as well, but they'll grow really shrub-like they could be in a container. Whereas your classic raspberries will shoot up lots more shoots and really spread out. Sometimes a little more than you thought. And then, so another couple things I'm going to showcase are annuals here. So these are some flowering annuals we offer. There's some marigolds and geranium. These are a great option for something, an area that you want to be able to plant color into. And if you buy starts from us, you'll be able to plant that color in right away. We do a great job of, Grace behind you here is our annuals buyer. She takes care of buying all these things, bringing them in at the right time of year so that we can offer wonderful flowering annuals for everyone. And they're a great option to plant in and around trees, lower tree, that under area that's always like, what do I do underneath my tree? These are a great option to provide color breakup and add color as well.
You can plant them outside now?
These are needing to get protected from the frost right now, so they're most advised to put into a container and then you can bring them in until we're past our last frost concerns. So that's something, these are considered a tender annual, which is one of your definitions you'll see on our pages here, meaning that you have to be cautious of the colder temperatures with these ones to be able to survive. Any other questions? So another great time to plant, since we don't want to do it in the middle of the summer, is the fall. Fall is a wonderful time to plant trees in particular. Trees can go in well in the spring, but it's best into the early spring so we don't have too much dry weather coming. If you do it in the fall, your rates of success are much, much greater, and you'll be able to have that dormancy be that first period you go through. So it initiates its spring growth directly into your new soil. Whereas if you get a tree in the spring, it's not that it won't survive, it'll just require a little bit more care in the spring than the one planted in the fall. Spring plantings typically need a little bit more water just so that they can initiate their roots into your native soil as well, whereas the one planted in the fall will do it more or less on its own because it's been sitting there ready to go.
I'm sorry, is that true for transplanting bushes and trees?
Yes,
too?
especially
In the
if you want to
fall?
move something within your yard, fall is definitely the best. You want to wait
Okay.
until we've had at least a couple weeks of rain so you've softened up your soil. Always encourage people to do that type of stuff around rain because despite it being a little messier, it will be significantly easier to dig the holes. So yeah, moving something too, if you have something in an undesirable location but you'd love to keep it, early spring or even late into the fall are the best chances to have it succeed in its new home.
Are we still in early spring?
We're still sort of in early spring, yeah.
Sort of.
First day of spring is what, tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that being, we're actually still in the tail end of winter then,
Uh-huh.
if you will.
Seemed like that.
Yeah.
I have a question about the Forsythia.
Yeah.
Is that a full sun plant?
That is a full sun plant, yeah. So it in fact loves the full sun. I think
How big does that get? I'm sorry.
it can get up to like 6 to 8 feet tall, and then from that height, it'll have long water shoots every year. And those water shoots every year are what produce the blossom. So the blossom grows on the New Year's growth. Yeah, they're definitely. This one looks a little bit funny based on how it was pruned, but the color is what I'm always after. Great. Is there any questions people have? Curiosities? Want to know more?
What annual flowers bloom the longest?
Ooh. I'm not quite sure on that. I do know if you deadhead your marigolds, you can get, throughout the summer, you can have growth. The catch to that being you do need to deadhead them. And again, that's another term that we've got on our page here, and it essentially, as soon as that flower starts to die, you can go and remove it, and it'll encourage the growth of more. Most annuals and even some perennial shrubs, flowering shrubs, will do better with deadheading. The more you deadhead, the longer through the season you can go. But marigolds come to mind as one of the longer ones through the summer, starting now all the way through October.
With clay soil, can you throw down wildflowers and hope that they'll take?
You can always throw them down and hope that they'll take. The catch to that being is you might be leaning on the hope a bit more than you want. They will more than definitely, if they germinate, will go down into clay soil. It's not that roots can't work their way through it. It's just without some sort of a mulch layer or something to cover them up a little bit. Clay soil is hard to plant into. You can plant onto it or incorporating more mulches or soil building conditioners. Those type of things will increase your odds. But if you were to just broadcast spread some wildflower mix on top of clay, you would have minimal success. But there's still a chance. I love hearing about the anomalies.
But you could put down some of that soil building conditioner
Yeah,
stuff
absolutely.
maybe as a layer on top of
Yeah, and then one of the best ways if you are planting into a clay mix like that is to go across it with a rake first. Just break up that clay, get it, broken up a little bit to where you can incorporate the seed and the mulch to a more favorable seed bed where things will germinate.
Thank you.
You bet.
How do you water a garden? Is it better off to have drip at the roots, or is overhead water okay?
That's a great question. So one of the best ways to water, especially as we head into the uncertainty of our water future as a world, really, drip emitters are one of the best ways. That being said, they can be somewhat complicated to get set up and going. So I tend to, tell beginners or people who are early on in learning these things to go the soaker hose route. It's much more user friendly. You don't typically have to have your pressure dialed in correctly. You can just hook your hose into it, set a timer, and let that be what waters your garden. Overhead watering for most things is excessive use of water for what you're actually getting. And so being able to hand water with a watering wand or to have drip irrigation set up to areas is probably the best way. But knowing that, you know, and starting a garden, all of that will demand every time you plant, taking a specific watering can out or a hose to that area to get something established in water.
So you could actually run a piece of PVC with T's and have a dripper hose so it comes on all at once, like with your sprinklers every day?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And in fact, that's the way I have my garden set up.
So you could have lots of the drip.
Right.
I mean the soaker hoses.
Correct. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
on 4 rows.
Yep.
Okay.
I actually have soaker hose in all of my strawberry beds, my berry vine beds as well, and so that's how I do a lot of my irrigating. And we sell soaker hoses here as well as timers. Being able to hook a timer up to your hose bib and set it to know you're going to get a half an hour of water every day, especially as we get into the hot times for things that are requiring more daily water, like your vegetables or your berries or your fruit bearing things, whereas your ornamental plants may only need water more like once a week, twice a week. But we also have multiple schedule ability timers available also. Timers are our gardener's best friend for watering.
How about vegetables that can grow not in full sun?
Not in full sun. Like which ones?
Yeah.
So the classics are most brassicas, despite needing some heat to get into a robust size. They can handle quite a bit of shade.
Okay.
And then lettuces are another really great one. Lettuces, in fact, thrive in the shade. The summer heat can be too hot for them, and they'll do what we call bolting, which they'll grow a seed stalk and start to flower. And once that happens, even though there's always a really great lettuce head, it is always bitter. So as soon as that flowering is initiated, your lettuce becomes a lot more bitter. So it's something that you want to stay ahead of. We offer shade cloth, which is something that you can have staked slightly above the canopy level of your lettuce and get a little bit further into the summer. But lettuce is so finicky with the heat that from mid-July through August, it's really tough to grow. And so that's when the shade cloth can give you an advantage to continuing through the summer. But it's definitely one that would do great in shade areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you say radish at the beginning?
Radish does well as well, and that's also one that's a really great short crop. It's like 55 days from putting your seeds in to harvest. And so that's another one on the food side of things that can be really fun to grow because it happens really quickly.
What about herbs and onions?
Like, are you asking the watering needs or?
No, just shade.
Shade, so they can do all right in shade. Most of our herbs do tend to like a lot more sun. I've seen some thyme do pretty well in shade, as well as the occasional chive, but the majority of those are sun loving.
Do you have a good source for, if I've never gardened before, a vegetable garden, like when to plant, what type of sun, is there a good source that you can recommend?
Honestly, we have some handouts that are pretty helpful from that standpoint as to like the timing of certain vegetables that can handle going out before our frost week is up. Typically, our last frost is no later than the Mother's Day is our kind of benchmark for if we haven't had a frost and it's Mother's Day, you're clear that we pretty much won't have one until the fall again. And so that's something that we have some handouts for, and I don't have a direct source that's like, here's a great go-to of all of those. If you're in garden centers, one of the best ways to go about that is each label will have a lot of that, especially on your vegetables, timing to plant, or if you need to wait for a frost. We have signage as well that is pointing out a lot of those things based on frost and timing of planting. Typically as well, though, the other not catch to that, but we bring in things at the right time to plant. So we have some tomatoes here, but we are selling them with the caveat that you better know what you're doing with these because they are at risk until our last frost is gone. But some people do really want to start early, and so they'll grow them inside for a little while to get a bit of a head start on the season.
Can potatoes grow in straw? I heard they could.
They
Would
can.
They get bigger than growing them in dirt?
I can't say to the bigger aspect because I've seen some absolutely monstrous ones grown in soil.
Really?
Yeah.
Does it have to be really lightweight soil?
No, I'd say heavy clays, or they're going to struggle. They won't branch as much. And branching, potatoes are, despite being considered a root vegetable, they're actually a stem vegetable. They grow along the stem of the plant, and so you actually have to keep burying your potatoes in order to have more success.
That's what confuses me, because I did it one way, she did it another. She put hers in and let them grow. I put mine every time the green came up, I covered it again, came up, I covered it again, and mine were little tiny potatoes.
Well, do you know what kind of potatoes they were?
I had all kinds.
Okay.
Every kind. And the littlest potatoes you ever saw. You could, it wasn't even worth your time to cook.
Well, yeah, so on that note, the one interesting note to that as well is you'll never grow 100 pounds of potatoes from one potato. Everyone thinks you can, though. The general, what's that?
I had 10 buckets.
Well, okay.
It was
I'm not
the
saying
biggest
you
raise.
didn't. I just, yeah. What I'm getting at is potatoes, there's a very specific ratio. If you plant 1 pound of potatoes, the most you're going to get is 10 pounds. And so that's something worth considering when planting. Having specific varieties that are known to grow well in certain conditions. So we have, like russets are a classic that need a more sandy type of soil so it can grow to that large size. Growing in straw is a great option, honestly, especially if you wanted to keep mounding them. As to them being bigger as a result of growing in straw, I can't attest to that
Do you
personally.
think they do better if I just mix the straw in with the dirt?
They'll do great. I wouldn't say better necessarily, but incorporating the straw incorporates what we call organic matter, and adding organic matter only increases your soil health. So it's a great move to go to. I would say you probably would see a better experience in that second year after adding it than that first year. But yeah, that is something I incorporate with my potatoes, partly as a weed suppressor as well. Straw on top of a row that you're going to be harvesting the roots of. It's really nice to have your weeds died down in that row so that they're not competing with what you're after, the roots.
On tomatoes, so last summer, not only me, but many of my gardener friends at work had a horrible year. When the heat was on, can you overwater tomatoes that
Absolutely.
are sitting in that heat?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what's your
And that's
advice on that?
honestly sometimes something that is what ends up causing the most issues with like blossom end rot, for example.
Yes, yeah.
And then blossom end rot is also accentuated with an extreme heat. And so you have the extreme heat. The knee-jerk reaction is to always water more. But there's actually a point where a plant can't uptake the water you're giving it. And so they'll all go through, some daily wilting to a degree, but that's just them regulating themselves. So even if they're in a wilt where you've got wet soil to the touch, but because it's wilting you want to water, it's not necessarily the right move. Making sure you're consistently watering is a better idea, and that's where the drip emitters, that they can become your best friend because they're right by the plant. They're giving a finite amount. You can have them varying from a certain amount per hour to just running during a certain time. That will give you the better even spread of your moisture, which is where you can avoid those problems. Is if you're consistently at the same moisture level, slightly dry, you're only adding a little, not a lot. You got to play with the ratios, so to speak, of drying and wetting down.
Even those days we were over 100.
Yeah, even those days, it's kind of crazy. Like we lost plants that we just couldn't give enough water, and that is an extreme heat that I really hope we don't ever go through again, because I'm getting married on that specific day this year, so I really don't want it to happen. But aside from that, those are the anomalies of every year. Last year in particular, 2021, we experienced an extreme frost and freeze last February. Then we saw record-breaking heat, and then also last bit of December we saw another snowstorm. So in one calendar year, we had 3 extremes that you typically in this area don't see in a 10 or 20 year span even. So it was anyone's guess as to what was going to survive that should classically survive. And yeah, the knee-jerk reaction is to always add more water, but sometimes people are adding that water in the heat of the day, and that's the worst time to add it because they're actually have done their internal plant systems are shutting down to sustain through the heat. And that wilting that you can see, despite, as the wanting to see nothing but thriving plants, is hard to see. It's supposed to happen. It's a part of the physiological, defense mechanisms that these trees, shrubs, and especially your annuals and your garden, your vegetable garden, will experience the most amount of that extremes and the wilting down. But my soil's still wet. What do I do? There's only so much we can do, but having the drip emitters and things like that are one of your best friends.
So putting a shade cover,
Yeah.
I mean, over vegetables, it seems
Yep.
like that's a no-brainer. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, how much is it true for tomatoes or peppers or things that love the full sun?
So there
I mean,
are
how
something
do you know?
you won't. So tomatoes and peppers do love the full sun. They're the few things, if not overwatered, not trying to pick on you, I'm just saying.
Right.
If not overwatered, actually thrived through that heat. I had probably my best pepper and tomato year this last year.
Yeah.
Like absolutely phenomenal. I couldn't have been more excited. But also, aside from the heat, I'm kind of going, what happened? And the heat played a great role in that. If your watering stays consistent and you're able to keep it the roots moist, the top of the plants will thrive for both tomatoes and peppers. There's a few other sun-loving things, that come to mind, like onions. They can handle a lot of sun. They'll grow real big and healthy. Garlic as well.
So even that extreme heat, they don't need shade.
Correct.
Okay.
Those, like in particular, are the ones that come to mind. But in the extreme heats, almost everything else could benefit from it. Especially your lettuces won't survive those extreme heats without it. And just 1 second, sorry. And then if you get into, what needs to be shaded, there's those few things that don't in the extreme heats, and then everything else can benefit from it. And that even goes like we offer a row cover that's technically for cold, but it works in reverse as well and will keep a little heat out. And so, there's many different ways to provide more shade to your garden. PVC hoops over your rows is the instinctful one that people go for to keep it off the ground.
Will squash do better with a shade cloth?
Squash will do pretty well in the heat. That's one you will see the most extreme wilting despite having enough water. And so the knee-jerk reaction is that it's in too much sun. Like it just can't handle it. But pumpkin fields, squash fields all over the Willamette Valley at 3 o'clock, 3:30 every day will look like they are dying. And in the morning will be completely upright and what we call the leaves praying to the gods, because they're like, wow, this is great sunlight and great cool weather in the morning. And so that's one that can handle the heat. It is one that is visually unpleasing when the heat comes, but they do go through it pretty well. Having some shade available for them will not make that extreme as bad, and they'll still do well. You may not get as many squash if you have it in a shaded area, but you might have a slightly healthier plant as a result. Any other questions?
You said you water your vegetables a few minutes every day?
Yeah, so in the vegetable world, more often with less water is a better approach than once with a lot of water. And so I actually water my garden every single day, but I typically only do it for about 15 minutes. And that's 15 minutes of drip as well. And so it's not like an open hose on a plant. It really is emitting a small amount of water, but it's emitting it directly into the zone where I'm growing the plant. And one of the other benefits you get from that is if you're not watering where your weeds are, the weeds don't grow as well. And they become easier to pull. And if you're overhead watering your entire garden while seemingly being rather effective, you're also watering every single weed seed that's ever been there. And the joke with seeds or weed seed is if you let it go to seed 1 year, it's 7 years to weed it to be rid of it ever. And so if you let that happen a few years in a row, you have enough seed forever.
I put weed block and bark down everywhere where I wasn't growing something, and that really helped.
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful way. Using weed block for your pathways where you're walking is another great way. And so even if you did have an overhead watering, you're not having seeds germinate in that area. Bark mulch and or wood chips are my favorite pathways because you can lay them on really thick. They settle down, they break down into organic matter. They help the overall moisture level of those areas stay higher, even in extreme heats. Some of the best street tree plantings you'll see, the way they survive the summer is they've got a thick layer of mulch around them. And the other ones that don't, you get these tree diapers that people fill all the time. They're actually called tree gaiters, but it makes it look like the tree has a diaper on it. And you fill it with water and it slowly leaks out over the course of several hours. But it's just so that you don't have to be there while it's watering. Whereas if you add mulches, you could just hand water on a once a week basis, and your mulches really help to keep in that moisture.
I'm sorry, so weed block, is that something that's like a chemical?
No,
And then
it's
add
actually a
mulch?
cloth.
Oh,
Yeah,
alright,
so we
okay, the
actually have
cloth.
lots of our
Okay,
plants
gotcha.
out on them in our displays here. And so it's an impermeable cloth. We have a true weed block, and then we have a weed barrier. Weed block is a really tight woven. It actually doesn't let as much water seep through. It eventually will, but it does provide some resistance. So water will pool up on it. And so there is that, you might have a puddle in that area potentially, but if you have mulch on top of it, it's not likely. And then weed barriers are permeable, so they allow water to go through. And that's something that people like to do in a landscaped bed, is to put weed barriers out and then cut a hole where you're putting your plant, so that everywhere around it is suppressed from its weed. And the catch to that is weed seeds will find their way into the mulch on top of it and still grow. But that's the labor of love we're involved in here with gardening.
I put it all the way around my house, but it's really easy to go out and weed because you don't get a lot of weeds, but you'll get a few in the bark, but they come right out.
Yeah, the weed roots won't be as deep as a result. Yeah. Makes your maintenance a little bit easier, that's for sure. That and drip, and you're in a real good place.
Use newspaper.
Yeah, that is a great method as well. You have a question in back?
The lettuce plants, is this not the greatest time to plant the lettuces and stuff?
This is actually a great time because we're past our harder frosts. Even if we get a frost in the next month or so, it'll likely be one that's right around freezing, not down into the low 20s or mid 20s. And they can handle that. They'll show a little wilt that first day potentially, but they bounce right back out of it. Lettuces are hardy into the 15 degrees typically, but they start to show damage once they get below 30. And so when we have those frosts that are a little bit later in this season, it's worth a few bucks. You could buy some row cover we offer, which is an insulating cover that you put over plants when we have that outlying frost state that shows up in April or May, and we go, oh gosh, what do we do now? And you can try and protect them that way. But classically, this is a great time to start your lettuces, partly because we have a small window. Once we get into the end of May, we're already into temperatures that can start to negatively affect the growth of our lettuces.
Can you talk about slugs and snails?
Like how to prevent them?
Mm-hmm.
So one of my favorite ways actually is to cut the bottom off of some plastic cups so they're about an inch tall, and any beer you don't like, you go pour about a half an inch into it and you put them out into your garden, and in the morning it'll be full of slugs. It's an interesting way to go about it, but they can't help themselves. They're attracted to it, and then they drink themselves to death. And the catch to it is it's kind of gross. You may have a dog or an animal or a neighborhood cat that drinks your beer. So that's a really great home remedy. The other way is we sell Sluggo here. We have it in organic. It's an organic product. and it's a slug bait, and so it does it attracts them, but to the degree that it will also kill them. And a mild sprinkling of that throughout your vegetable garden and anything else that's seeing slug damage will do well, but it requires multiple applications throughout your year. You can't just, okay, I did one, because they'll come back. And then the same goes for the beer traps and other traps like that. If it's a trap, you got to clean it out or replace it or things like that. I've heard of people putting like a wooden plank out in their garden, and in the morning they turn it over and knock them all in the garbage can, because they'll be attached to the underside of all the wet boards. And so there's a couple of different home remedies like that, but slugs will be a constant battle. 9 out of 10 slug species are invasive, and so that in itself just tells me that even if I found the one, I'm not interested.
Right.
Enough damage has been done to my gardens. I'm very against slugs. Another home remedy option, and then we sell as well another couple, is Diatomaceous Earth. Is essentially a soil amendment that has a lot of really sharp, tiny particles in it. And what it does is cuts up the stomach of the slugs as they get towards your plants. And then a home remedy alternative is if you happen to have chickens or you eat a lot of eggs, ground up eggshells do the same thing. And so if you're eating a lot of eggs or you have chickens, that's something that you can explore. The best way to do it is to put them in the oven, bake them, so that any of the gooiness dries out, and then put them in a blender that you don't like, and literally blend them up into a fine pulp almost. And if you put a small ring around your plant with that in it, or the Diatomaceous Earth, or a little bit of Sluggo, those things will all prevent the slug from getting onto your plant.
How about baking soda? That's supposed to be a natural way, but you can't get it on the plant.
Correct. So I try not to do anything that I can't accidentally get on my plant. Because if I'm trying to combat something and then I mess my crop up by doing that, I would have rather picked some slugs off of it than killed it myself.
What about the white moth? I tried growing broccoli. It was horrible. It was a mess. Those ashy eggs and all that.
Yeah, so that's a pest that we offer some organic sprays for that'll do a little bit of help, but it's such a prolific pest throughout the whole summer that you have to stay on it. But we are considering bringing in, there's these little white butterfly imitators, and if they see one in your garden, mechanically flapping about, they'll assume that someone's already there and they'll move on. That's just a theory. It's a new product coming out, so I'm going to try and make some at home and see what we can figure out. But yeah, that is something that you just sort of have to be aware of. I personally go out and actually catch them with a bug net as often as I can, because every butterfly that you get will eliminate thousands of worms.
What about lace bugs and rhododendrons?
That's a really tough one. It requires quite a bit of care to get that back in order. Several rounds of sprays, and then we also have nematodes that we can sell that will help to prevent the continued colonization of a plant. But if you have an infestation you're aware of already, some of the only ways to get rid of it are through sprays. Sometimes we have organic ones for the ornamental side of things. Since you're not eating it, conventional sprays are not necessarily the worst thing. A lot of people's knee-jerk reaction is to just completely steer clear of them, which isn't necessarily a bad approach. It's just a different option for folks. The organic route with ornamentals in particular will be a harder battle to win. With vegetables, it's, you're getting what you put into it out of it. It seems a little more worth it with the vegetables. With the ornamentals, I'm not eating any of them if I'm not going to be actively pruning my plants often. I'm okay to get myself ahead of a problem doing a spray. Any other questions? All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for coming in today. I really appreciate it. It gave me a good opportunity to get out in front of people, share what I love to do, and thank you.